Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where I shine light on things that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Sally Clarke about the state of burnout. Sally's a senior consultant at Infinite Potential and the co-host of the podcast, We Are Human Leaders. Sal, thanks so much for joining me.
Such a pleasure to be with you, Nicole. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. And we've been meaning to do this for a little while, so I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, we've been cooking this for a bit.
But for people who might not have met you before, can you share a little bit about your background and experience?
Sure. So I'm a former finance lawyer and I went through a fairly catastrophic burnout myself, and almost 15 years ago now. I collapsed at an airport, started crying and I couldn't stop. And it was that moment of deep realization that things were really bad and needed to drastically change. And I was in the privileged position of being able to decide to leave that field of work. Became a yoga and meditation teacher, moved to Morocco, lived in Portugal, had wonderful adventures. And eventually I got really curious about what had happened to me. At the time, I was even reluctant to use the word burnout. It had this stigma and shame attached to it. But once I got curious, I realized very quickly when looking at the research that burnout is actually not the individual's fault. And this was a huge revelation for me, which prompted me to write two books about burnout. It brought me into contact with Infinite Potential and the work of Dr. John Chan. And so we've been collaborating on the state of workplace burnout study and report for the last 4 years. We're now conducting the survey for the fifth time, so it's really exciting. And it's really allowing me to live my mission, which is to embed well-being at work so that the term burnout becomes redundant.
Oh, I love that. And it's funny what our body does when we burn out as well. I remember when it happened to me, and it just kind of says, you haven't listened to me for a really long time, and I'm going to force you to do that now.
I have been waving red flags for years at this point. It's a hard stop now.
Yes. And you mentioned that you're in the fifth year of the State of Burnout Report. Um,
Hmm.
what are some of the themes and trends that you've seen over the years, and what are you finding?
Yeah, great question. So we've seen sort of a steady increase since 2020, the first time the study was conducted. We actually saw it level out a little bit this year. So in the most recent report, it was actually at about 38%, tracking against 38% the previous year. I do just want to hit pause there for a second. That does still mean that 2 in 5 people are experiencing all three dimensions that we use to measure burnout. So exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. So that's still a fairly drastic statistic, even if it is leveling out. One of the interesting findings this year was also that while the general rate of burnout had stabilized, the gender gap had actually grown quite significantly. So we saw for men, there was actually a drop in the rate of burnout from 33 to 30%, but for women, it grew to 42%. So this is actually a shift from a gap of 7 to 12% in the space of a year. So this got us really curious. I've been having a lot of conversations with leaders of all genders this year to try and understand and elucidate what is going on for women. So this year in our study, we've actually incorporated a number of questions specifically for women to help us understand a little bit more deeply what is going on for them in the workplace that's really driving this sort of significant growth in the rate of burnout. We also saw this year, we last year we worked together with an organization that helps companies shift to reduced working time modalities. So that can be a 4-day week or a 9-day fortnight. And the difference, Nicole, for companies that have gone through that very mindful and carefully planned shift from 5 to 4 days, for example, the general population rate of burnout is at 42%. For them, it was 9%. So what we're seeing there is really a validation of our hypothesis that when organizations really look at reducing inefficiencies, improving efficiencies, detoxifying culture, and really making some fairly profound, often quite small, but intentional shifts in how we work and things like work design and job design, we see a really phenomenal outcome in terms of improved well-being and reduced burnout. So that was another huge finding for us this year.
It is. It is, and I know a lot of organizations are really reluctant to do something like that because it's different and new. And
Mm.
the conversations I have with leaders is, oh, so you pay them 5 days, but they only work four. And it's like, well, it's more about the outcome and the result rather
Yeah.
than the hours worked. Like you having
Yes.
to sit there and look at them for that many hours during the week. Like, are our all of the hours that we're working productive? And we know that the answer is no, because we
Yeah.
need to be able to go in ebbs and flows with our energy.
Yeah.
I always know that on a Friday afternoon, there's really not a lot of work to be done. And if you are booking in meetings on a Friday afternoon, maybe just revisit that because our
Yes.
brains probably don't want that.
Exactly. And I think it's such a great point, Nicole. I think it's really about this is a very arbitrary idea that we have that we're paying people for 5 days work. You're not, I think in a lot of cases, and it depends a lot depending on sector and industry, but often we're not actually, if we shouldn't think of it as paying people for the hours that they're working. It's paying them for the outcomes that they deliver and what they contribute to the organization. And I think when we frame it that way, we can actually see that there is a lot to be gained in terms of reduced overheads for an organization of moving to 4 days a week, and the incredible when people are motivated by the idea of getting some time back through, 4 day week or similar modality, it really incentivizes that change. And we actually see, often product people actually have higher productivity at 4 days a week than they did at five. And
Mm.
I think, again, it's kind of about letting go of a lot of these archaic ideas that we have about work, whether it's that we all have to be in the office 5 days a week and we all have to the sort of old school set of metrics that we have around measuring what it means to be a good employee.
Mhm.
And I think, a lot of our work now too at Infinite Potential is about helping leaders understand that that's simply not good enough anymore. And that's certainly not going to fly, particularly with the newer generations of workers that are entering the workforce and expressing new needs and expectations from the organization.
And one of the big issues or differences, I suppose, is the manager perception gap, right? Can you explain a little bit about what that is and how that
Absolutely,
impacts?
Nicole. Yeah, this was one of the really interesting findings that we had this year. So for the first time, we asked not only for people how they felt their well-being had been over the past 12 months, so had it improved, stayed the same, or reduced. We asked managers how they thought their people's well-being had tracked over the last 12 months. And what we saw was a really quite startling gap in that managers had perceived people's well-being to be significantly better or staying the same, whereas people were saying that it was actually, in many cases, getting worse. So that perception gap, it's not to blame managers. I think there's a lot of pressure on managers to be doing more and more, things being added to their pile without things being taken off, and this expectation that you'll somehow magically know how your people are going without the framework to do so, without the training to do so. So there's definitely, this is not intended to blame managers, but simply to shed light on there's a disparity there
Mm.
between what managers think is happening and what's really happening. To me, Nicole, that suggests that there is, two sort of obvious things come to mind. One is that there's perhaps some communication strategies that we can use to improve that sense of connection and that sense of perhaps psychological safety for people to be more transparent about how they're doing. But I suspect also, and the data supports this, that there's a lot of managers who themselves are grappling with burnout or the chronic stress that leads to burnout, and therefore simply not really in a position to have the perspective and energy that it takes to really connect with the team and have that sort of the eyes across those kind of metrics.
Yeah. And managers are often promoted to those positions based on their skill set. But the
Mm,
skill set of a leader is very different to the skill set of someone within the team. And they feel that they need to continue on with the work, but then manage people in their team. And people don't like to be managed, they like to be empowered and led. So,
exactly.
not having those relationship building skills or not having the support to move into that leadership role has
Yeah.
a huge impact on the entire workplace, on psychosocial safety, on psychological safety, and
Yeah.
all of the things that you and I do.
Exactly. I think in a lot of ways, and this might sound, so I'll say it first, then I'll give my disclaimer afterwards. I believe that, a really smart organization will be offering semi-leadership training to every employee that comes in. So from the moment that you're onboarded, you're treated as a future leader, whatever that might mean. And that means, you're building those communication skills, empathy, active listening, and mindful communication, as well as self-awareness that is inherent to being a good leader, and empowering everyone in the organization to start to build that skill set from early on. And then obviously perhaps with some additional training once those formal roles are assigned. And that might sound like it's an extra cost, but when we think about the incredible cost of absenteeism and turnover and reduced productivity and quality of work
Mm.
that burnout and stress and other mental health issues can lead to, it is a cost-saving mechanism.
100%. And the problems that I see are things around conflict, managing performance, managing
Mm.
bullying either at peer, from above, or within your team. Like these are the things that we don't have the skill set for, which lead on to, everything that you've written about, everything that you research, and everything that you do to help prevent and manage burnout. So it does need to be something quite holistic, and the cost of hiring and recruiting and all of the things that come around that, like
Yeah.
what is the cost of destroying a team simply because you just don't have this skill set? Most people really want to succeed, right? So if we can give them the tools to do that, then
Yes.
everyone flourishes.
And I couldn't have said it better myself, Nicole. You nailed it. And I think it's this thing as well that kind of, on a level, it makes me really sad when I think of people who enter a profession, and most of the time there's a strong sense of motivation, whether it's a passion for what they do or whether it's a real belief in the importance and the purpose of the work that they do. And to see that eroded through issues like bullying or poor leadership or just absent leadership, loneliness and isolation in the workplace, these things that are actually very remediable, but because they're not this, I think at almost a societal level, there's an incredible impact, and it's really, really call on all leaders to not get weighed down by the negativity of that situation and those kind of issues that might be prevalent in their organization or their industry, but to be thinking about, yes, the data says things are bad, but there are impactful strategies we can adopt. Let's start talking about that and let's start doing something about that.
Yes. Less talking, more doing.
Yes.
Do you think the stats have increased? And look, I have seen this question be asked for almost every topic when it comes to psychosocial hazards and well-being at work
Mm.
and neurodiversity. And we could go on, but do you
Mm.
think the stats have increased because the awareness of what burnout is has increased? Or do you think we're just given now the opportunity of saying, hey, I do have a problem. Someone's asking me about this now, so I'm going to speak up.
It's a great question, and I think there's no one sort of simple answer to it. One of the things that for me is really important is that in the research we do, we really have a very robust index that we use to ascertain burnout rates.
Mhm.
So, a lot of the stats that we'll see will be very like directly self-reported. One question, have you felt burn? This is what burnout more or less is. Have you felt burnout?
Mm.
And while there's some validity to that, we do tend to get really high statistics when we ask that because, of course, like a lot of people are experiencing chronic stress at work. But I think it's really important that we're very mindful, and a former lawyer, so I'm probably a bit focused on those definitions, but the World
Yeah.
Health Organization has given us a specific definition of burnout. It's about chronic workplace stress, and there are three dimensions. And not to, chronic stress itself in any form is really bad, and exhaustion alone is also, it can be a horrible experience. But I think we really need to be very specific about what we're talking about when we talk about burnout. And I think, to some extent, if some of the increase in the rate of burnout is driven perhaps by an increased self-awareness, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily.
Mm.
um, yeah, I think, and one of the challenges with burnout, that even when we do have this incredibly robust index, it's still people self-reporting.
Yes.
And speaking truthfully about my own burnout, until that moment that I collapsed at an airport, I was in deep state of denial. So I'm curious to know for myself whether I would have been able to admit to myself through doing a survey
Mm.
that things were not okay. I probably would have been like, fine, 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 nothing to see here,
Yep.
because that was the message I wanted to hear myself. So very long-winded answer, but simply to say that um, the data is, I think it's compelling. We do have a lot of research done in this arena. And while it's strongly pointing to, increasing rates of burnout, we're also seeing some fairly, low hanging fruit in terms of strategies that leaders can implement to
Mm.
start to reduce those really root causes of burnout. And rather than focusing on the sort of the toxic outcome, which is burnout, really looking upstream at what we can do to change how we work
Yeah.
and our workplaces, so that those statistics will drop significantly potentially as a result.
Can you share some of those with us? So, what have you seen that really fixes burnout, but also maybe on the flip side of it as well, to see what are some of the things that workplaces or maybe even leaders or individuals are doing that maybe don't have a lot of value and we should maybe be avoiding? One of the ones that always comes out is, the fruit bowls.
Yeah, look, and I say as a qualified yoga and meditation teacher, yoga and meditation will not solve burnout in your
Yeah.
organization. I guarantee it. Yeah, I mean, we use the workplace sustainability framework. So from a high level, this means looking at 5 different aspects of the workplace to identify where there are issues. And so these are protection from harm, which really looks at the sort of physical and psychosocial hazards that can be in the workplace, and making sure that there are robust mental health policies to support people when things do start to veer off course. The second is human leadership. So this is really ensuring that leaders are empowered with the tools and skills that they need to lead, to meet the needs and expectations of new generations in this very modern workforce that we're seeing now. The third is people-centered structures. So it's identifying what's going well and what's going not so well in terms of policies and structures within the organization and redressing those. Often we see in organizations there'll be 5 very similar policies for slightly different things. People get really confused about it, don't know what to do, and it just ends up staying in this sort of messy situation. So these are often things that can be redressed in a matter of weeks, but they're just ignored and taken as the norm.
Mm.
The fourth is team connection. So what we often see is that even in environments that are very stressful for people to work, perhaps frontline workers, we see that when people feel a strong sense of connection to their team, it's actually a really strong mitigating factor for burnout. So through ensuring that there is a strong sense of team connection, psychological safety, innovation, and sort of social connection. Again, this there is not one way that looks, and we all have different needs as individuals as to what that might look like. But it really is a very important factor in preventing burnout. And finally, personal growth. And this is really the aspect of ensuring that people have the opportunities to learn, to evolve themselves on work time, built into part of their role, part of their job, so that they can grow and evolve in themselves, not just in terms of the skills and the knowledge that they need to perform in their role, but also other aspects of their own personal growth.
Mm.
And also to the extent possible, depending on the organization, but there's also career growth opportunities. For example, secondments, moving around to different departments, that conversation is happening and that people are supported in their needs in that way. And that's something that I think is often sort of overlooked or thought as a sort of a nice to have add-on. We'll maybe do a bit of L&D or a lunchtime learning, but when we really embed that into what work means and is, it creates an incredible strength and loyalty for people as well, because they're having that basic psychological need met in their workplace.
Yeah, and they're able to contribute and grow as a human. Like back in the old days, mental health wasn't discussed. Like you and I were born in the 1900s.
Yep. Deep in the
And
1900s in my case.
We often heard things like have a cup of concrete, or we don't
Yep.
talk about our feelings,
Yep.
or
Yes.
you go to work to do the job and you didn't bring anything with you. And some might say that we've kind of the pendulum swung a bit too far, but not have any growth or development opportunity to improve in yourself and in your role, the
Yep.
company's really missing out if they're not doing that.
Enormously. It's such a simple thing that you can implement that can create incredible engagement and really drive significant difference in terms of retention as well, because that is something that people is really meaningful for us as humans. And of course, there is a cost of living crisis and pay will always be a factor, but there are so many other ways and strategies that leaders can use. Whether, just to give a couple of perhaps more granular examples, one thing that we've done recently with a client is really help them focus on their meeting hygiene. Now, this sounds like super obvious. We're all in meetings all the time, but when we do those differently, there can be really drastically different outcomes. So they've looked at things like empowering people to block their calendar when they need to do deeper work, simple cues and language that the company, the organization shares around communicating their needs and ensuring that meetings are really practical and helpful. Only the people who need to be there are there, having a set agenda, like these very sort of things that we sort of think, oh, is that really going to make that much difference? And it really is in a lot of cases. Those kind of simple cost-free changes can have a huge impact for culture.
100%. And I've never heard anyone say, can we have more meetings?
Yeah. Literally no one ever. Yeah, no. It's one of those things, like meetings are essential. And I think, I've worked a lot by myself and I notice I love, good meetings can be incredible. We can get so much out of them. And a good meeting can save 50, 100 emails.
Yeah.
But we've also all been in those meetings where we wonder if we should even be there, where time is basically wasted, and it can be intensely demoralizing, especially if we've got a to-do pile that's this high and we're sitting in a meeting that feels pointless. It's no wonder that it really sort of evaporates motivation and engagement.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, one of the things I used to do with a team as well is we need to make time for fun as well, especially if you're virtual. So
Yep.
on a Friday, I would do a 10:30 like coffee catch up, and it would be anything other than work. We would play
Yep.
games, we would have fun, we would do try and guess the Aussie slang because I had a really diverse team. So
I
saying things
love
like,
that.
what's a double plugger? They had no idea.
I don't think, like, sorry, I've like, is that a thong?
It is. But what's a thong to an Australian is
This
very
is
different.
true. This is true. There's layers to our vernacular.
Flip-flop for people listening in that may not know what a thong is and think we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things as well that I've, have discussions with leaders who are like, we don't want to burden people with something that's not that, we just want to let them do their work and then go and spend their time in their own ways. But I think particularly when we're looking at remote and hybrid environments, and our study has also over the years looked at that.
Mm.
And honestly, what it shows is there is no one magic solution. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. And so if you are in a remote or hybrid situation, it is key to hold space for those kind of social connections, even if it feels uncomfortable, because it really is something that it is the connective tissue that holds the rest of the work week together.
Yeah.
And I think particularly for people who've never had the opportunity to meet in person and sort of, have this sort of remote collaboration, even 5 or 10 minutes of perhaps sharing about your pets or your weekend or the TV show you're binging at the moment, it really has, I think untold power in terms of then forging that sense of team connection for the longer term.
Definitely. And it just reminded me of something else I used to do when we were all remote for such a long time.
Mm.
I'd pop in a Monday and a Wednesday, I think, just a morning, like 8:30, I think it was, for 10 minutes, just to a coffee high to
Yeah.
basically, you know, how you're walking into the office and you say,
Yeah.
"Good morning, how was your weekend?" Like any of that. So it
Mm,
was not compulsory. People who wanted to jump in could, and it was just another opportunity to reach out and stay connected because,
mm.
as you said earlier, you know, that isolation and remote work can be quite difficult. Um,
Yes.
but 10 minutes, you know, some people jump in just for five or whatever works for you and your team, just
Mm.
being flexible and not feeling like you have to know everything and do it yourself. Like, ask the team, what works for you? What do you want to do? Let's trial something. If it doesn't work, then change it. But yeah, I think that was something that really helped keep that connection together as well, and something really simple.
I love that. Exactly. And that is like an experiment you can run with zero cost. Like it is a fairly like low bar. And that's that, and then co-creating that with the team. It's like, what aspect of that do you like? And involving them in that in that process as well. And I think one thing that we're seeing increasingly is also an understanding of sort of what it means to be truly holistically inclusive. So people have an array of different needs, and certainly if we're neurodivergent, that can be different to some to others, introverts, extroverts, different cultural backgrounds. There's all these different ways that we have of being as humans.
Mm.
And I think it's we leaders can sometimes overestimate how much energy and effort it takes to draw people in and create a very inclusive culture.
Mm.
It's something that we can achieve by simply by treating everyone as human, and that their needs and their individuality is not only valid, but it's meaningful and contributes to the work environment. So I think if we sort of particularly, and the temptation in the remote arena is very strong, I think, to just go, no, just get the work done.
Mm.
But we miss what is, again, this basic human psychological need that we have, which is to feel important, to feel connected, to feel meaning, to feel seen and heard and valued. And these days, it's essential that workplaces are meeting that need to the extent that they can.
Yeah, 100%. And I am so glad that we finally got together to chat about this on the pod. Thank you so much. But you also are the co-host of the We Are Human Leaders podcast. Do you want to
Yes.
share a little bit about that and what your goal is, what you chat about there? And yeah, the audience might want to check that one out next.
We do. Yeah, we have some amazing guests already lined up for 2025. So we are human leaders together with Alexis Zana. We speak with leaders that are really driving new ideas and at the forefront of a new wave of leadership, if you will, really looking at the sort of the human in all of us. We talk about, we're human first and we're leaders second, and really looking at practical things that we can do to improve our teams. We speak with a lot of people about the research that they've done, the books that they've written, from radical respect to radical humility to neurodiversity to, all kinds of topics that I think are really exciting for leaders to be hearing. And first episode for 2025 is with Amy Gallo, who we interviewed when she was at South by Southwest in Sydney recently. So definitely stay tuned for that. But yeah, look out for We Are Human Leaders. We'd love to have you join the movement.
And I'll share a link to the pod, plus a few things that you shared in our chat as well as the fifth survey, because I know that you're looking for people to complete that one. So I'll add that one there as well. But what's the best way for people to get in contact with you, to find out more, to buy your books? How should they reach out?
Reach out and find me on LinkedIn. I think that's probably the easiest way, and then we can connect on whatever level you'd like to, about my books, the work with infinite potential, or the podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sal. I really appreciate it.
It's been such a pleasure, Nicole. Thanks for having me.